Okay, they're telling me that we should go ahead and get started. So we will do that. This is the last panel of the day. And again, I'm Denise Rozell from AUCD. I am the moderator for this panel. And I think we'll just, I guess we'll introduce each person as they go, now. Everybody now? Or as you go forward? Doesn't matter. Okay. So immediately to my right, the first speaker, Tim Tansey from the University of Wisconsin, talking about a case study on inclusion of people with disabilities in the manufacturing setting. Reagan Baughman, next to him, from UNH, on employment incentives in SSDI, lessons from the VA disability program. So we have a veterans piece to this one. And then John O'Neill and Elaine Katz, who should by this point in the day be familiar to all of you, from the Kessler Foundation, talking about the supervisor perspectives and the employment disability survey. So there is a timekeeper in front, so I'm going to let you guys get started. Tim, it's to you.
Good afternoon. I'm glad I made it here finally. Fortunately, I got out of Madison just before the 10 inches of snow fell last night. So excited to be here, excited that the kids have finished shoveling the driveway at this point. I've been told there's supposed to be another 6 inches by the time I get back, and that's on me. Yeah. So today I want to talk a bit about one study under one phase of one project amongst many projects. My general presentation style, though, is I'm going to make all of you do some work, and I'll try to throw out some softball questions to start off with. Why do employers hire people to work for them? What are employers looking for? Why do they need people?
Productivity.
Productivity. What kind of productivity?
Good productivity.
Well, that's a variable. We won't even get into good productivity, but they're looking for something to be produced. They need some type of service. They need some type of product. So every employer out there is essentially looking for the same thing. They are looking for people to do work for them, to help them accomplish some greater goal. Now, we've all worked with different employers. Would we describe maybe every employment instance we've ever been in as being comparable to the one before it? Have we had good employment settings versus maybe ones that we kind of talk about at parties now saying, let me tell you about a job I once had? So what's the difference between those? When you think about a good employment experience versus your own experiences as far as one that wasn't so great, what are some of the defining pieces of, let's keep it positive. What were the defining components of your positive employment experiences? Yeah?
It's the people, it's the people in my colleagues and my coworkers and my collaborators. It's the people I work with.
Okay, the people we work with, yeah. I mean, first of all, they're fun to be around. You enjoy their company, that they're part of a team, so they're promoting each other at the same time as we're working together. Of course. What else? I mean, people is one thing, but there's other things we look at as far as why we stay at a job versus move on.
I was actually able to do the job.
You could do the job.
Resources provided and the scope provided.
That's right. So you had a sense of what you were supposed to be doing, you had the capacity to do it, and you had the resources to make it happen. What else? You were having an impact. What does that mean? You got to clarify things for me.
That you believe what you were doing matters to something beyond you.
All right. There's a greater purpose. You can see the greater vision of what you're trying to do, and that it's not just you accomplished what you had set out for a task for that day, but you found that it had some greater benefit, whatever it was, to the broader community, to the people around you. There was one person in the back that a couple of. You're compensated fairly. I'm still looking for that to happen, but no. That you're compensated. You feel like that what you're being paid is consistent with what you should be paid for that type of work. In the back, ma'am? Yeah.
Inclusivity. With someone with a disability, I always like to look around and see are they actually hiring people, all different scopes of people.
Okay, and I agree completely. We start thinking about employers, and I want to talk today again. I will get to the slides. Slides are boring. I've been told that when I present, watching paint dry is an enjoyable experience. So bear with me on some of these things. But in thinking about the employment setting, One of the things we can look at under the Workforce Investment and Opportunities Act, we've moved from can we get somebody into a job to can they retain that work? Is there a long-term benefit for this individual? Are they doing better over time? Are they increasing in wages? Are they increasing in hours? One of the important things that we were looking at under the Rehabilitation Research Training Center on employer practices is what is going on with those employers that we can talk to and identify who is more likely to hire. And the reality is that we're finding out fairly quickly is the employers that are more willing to hire individuals with disabilities are setting up workplace environments that are more likely to retain those individuals over the long term. So a little foreshadowing of the things that I'm going to talk about in the remainder of I got like 10 minutes, so I'm good. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'll try the button here, there we go. So one of the projects that we're doing under the RRTC is going out and actually talking to employers. Not sending a survey, not asking them to fill out a piece of information here. Certainly, I mean, we can look at their overall outcomes and how many people they've hired over the years, but actually going into employers and identifying what are you doing? How would you represent your efforts to hire individuals with disabilities? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to all the other individuals working at this job, at this employer? What is the experience of individuals with disabilities at that employer? So that if the employer says, oh, we're very welcoming, and we get kind of something different from the employee, is this really a conducive, supportive, is there a good temperature to this workplace when we talk about long-term success? So we're in the process of doing a number of these case studies. 9 is kind of the minimum. We're looking at actually doing additional ones of these where we're going out and talking to employers, not just one type of employer, looking at employers of different size, because what a small employer, an employer that has less than 50 employees might describe as being how we approach things, doesn't work for the corporation with 10,000 employees, and vice versa. Also, we've identified very quickly is what is useful in a manufacturing setting may not work so well in a other customer service setting. It may not work so well in a technology setting. It may not work well in a healthcare setting based on how those different areas of those employers are set up in those different industries. So we've gone through this process with one employer so far. We have a number of additional of these case studies scheduled at this point, but I want to talk about the first one, because one of the things that when we first started putting this project together is looking at what are the areas that we might want to know more about, and coincidentally, we started looking at what has been the rise in manufacturing in the United States in the last 4 years, trying to identify particularly employers that are related in manufacturing that may be an initial step for a number of individuals with disabilities. So we conducted a group of interviews with individuals from all different levels of the company Hart Schaffner Marks. This is a manufacturing plant in Des Plaines, Illinois. Does anyone know what Hart Schaffner Marks produces? Suits. I at least had the foresight that before I met with the CEO, I went out and bought one of their jackets so that if he asked me what I was wearing, I could say, well, of course, Hart Schaffner Marks. We went ahead and did a number of different interviews ranging from with the CEO, the CFO, the leadership of the organization, to the mid-level managers who are actually driving different divisions responsible for those areas, all the way down to the workers who are doing the work on a daily basis. The individual who is working in the sewing department, the individuals who are working on the loading docks, who are managing their internet platforms, to find out how they have perceived individuals with disabilities as being a part of the workplace. So we used 5 interviewers, we had 3 different coders and an auditor to look at both collecting the data, identifying kind of the major pieces of themes that were coming out of the information from a qualitative standpoint, and then ultimately someone to evaluate, here's the thematic representation of that information. So moving forward, this is what I'm going to talk about, and I think if I don't hit it often enough. There we go. So over a 2-day period, we interviewed 33 Hart Schaffner Marks in Autism Workforce. Autism Workforce was a private company that was working with Hart Schaffner Marks to try to help them look at their inclusivity of persons with disabilities. So as I mentioned, upper level management, being able to talk to what the CEO, the CFO, the director of HR are telling you about how important the hiring and inclusion of persons with disabilities are, and then being able to compare that to those supervisors, the person who's responsible for the loading dock, the person who's responsible for the sales department. How do they express it? And then look at that in relation to the supervisors, then ultimately coworkers with them and employees with autism and individuals without. There were some domains that we identified, and I'm jumping ahead to the domains because I realize I only have, 10 minutes left? 12? 5? I was told that I had 15 minutes just to gamble, just to drone on. But what was interesting is there were certain domains that we saw across, whether it would be the management team, the supervisors, or the employees, and certain ones that were specific to the management team. From looking at the groups across, as far as shared across all groups, we're looking at how do they evaluate autism workforce, or really look at this approach to inclusivity of persons in the workplace. We identified the impact of the influence of the Autism Initiative on HSM and its employees, and I'll describe each one of these in greater detail. The performance and integration of employees with autism, and the characteristics of hard chapter marks. What is it about this employer that influenced the success of this type of integration program? And certainly talk about, from the management perspective, it was interesting hearing how they would like to see this program proceed in the future and grow over time. So we think about evaluations of autism workforce. This secondary company that was working with them on inclusivity was the idea of anxiousness, the idea of being hesitant for both employees, for supervisors, about the hiring of persons with disabilities when this program first started. It was the idea that we're not really sure what's going to happen. We're being told from a top-down model that this is an area that we want to increase the company profile in. We want to be looked at as an inclusive company. Now, when you actually talk to your mid-level manager, when you talk to the CFO, they all said, we're not sure if this is going to work, if this is a good idea. Now, they changed their tune over time, but still, when we think about the original hesitation, the initial resistance that they experienced in looking at adopting a fairly inclusive program, we have identified, again, across the board, this same hesitation. We've heard it time and time before as far as employers not wanting to hire somebody because they worry about productivity. They worry about fit with the other employees. Is this person going to be a good social addition? We worry about whether or not there's going to be other issues as far as what their needs are going to be as far as workplace accommodations. All those things were coming out in these initial interviews as far as these were the pieces that we were worried about first and foremost. What was interesting then, they immediately said, but, they'd say, well, we were worried, but, and I'm always looking for the but, because it essentially negates everything that they just said. We were worried, but now we have a very different perspective. They've talked extensively about the benefits of the Autism Initiative, and this is kind of our phrasing of it, because this is how they say, we're really excited about that we're doing this now. We're really excited that we're engaged in this. And I think it was over here as far as that sense of greater impact. It helped the company, but it helped me personally. It gave people a sense of purpose beyond, I come in every day to help make a suit. I come in every day to work on the sales floor or to talk with different wholesalers about buying our product. Now I come in and I'm a company that's doing all those things, but I've identified that we are a disability inclusive workplace. I feel good about that as being a part of our mission, that we are not only looking at the individuals who are we're going to be selling our clothes to, who are both the people who are working with us as well as outside, but ultimately that we're living that talk. We're actually being inclusive in our workplace as much as we are trying to be inclusive in who we sell to. I'm not going to read through all the quotes because they're up on the screen, and I know I've only got, is that 5? It's kind of hard for me to read from here. When we think about this, it was great to hear a member of the management team who talked about this as it makes a better work experience overall. I didn't do it.
Your time's off. Joke about the time.
Yeah.
Is this what they do? I mean, it's better than the hook. I told you, watching paint dry is just so much more fun. That's okay. I will keep us going. We're at 0 minutes, but essentially,
okay.
Here we go. We're
There you
booting
go.
back up. I only have 3 slides left. Be very, very quick.
You're good.
Wait, it's I can't do anything. The clicker won't work, I think, until it's hit view show. No, you're going the wrong way. There we go, Tim Tansey, you had it up. Ah, dear. All right, I do have to keep respectful of time of my co-presenters without going too far into it. You can go ahead and pull up the next one. What we're finding and what was clear, before they started this type of inclusivity program, if you actually asked them what was the environment like, it was not an inclusive environment. They were not necessarily engaged. When you talk about providing accommodations for anybody, individuals with short-term impairments, individuals who are having some limitations, that was a burden. That was something we didn't necessarily want to look at. It affected the overall productivity of that department. Subsequent to this engagement in an inclusive workplace, you actually had the sense of a sense of pride. You had this sense of warmth around how do we support each other, not just the individuals that have come in through this specific project. How do we support the individual in the workplace that is now experiencing cancer and going through treatment for cancer? How do we support that individual that's had a cardiac event and looking at how do we adjust their experience in the workplace to make it one that's acceptable and inclusive of them? So if you talk to the employees all the way from the CEO down, there was this push for inclusion. The adoption of the internal benefit of feeling like I was included did not happen until well into the process. But it is that idea of how do we get there from A to B, without talking too much about it, because it's important, you guys will ask me questions about it, I'm sure, at the end. It was the focus of the CEO, CFO saying, we are going this route by requiring diversity training, by requiring outreach and people to spend time. But it was a requirement of integration of persons with disabilities at all levels of the employer. It wasn't an enclave. It wasn't the idea we're going to hire that token individual over in this one area. It was looking at where can we look at hiring individuals as part of our regular process, developing interview protocols to make sure that we were providing accommodations at the forefront of that process, and then ultimately having those opportunities for individuals to check in with their supervisor, check in with HR on a regular basis, that they could express concerns that they had, needs that they had, talking with family members if family members were engaged, but having that component, that broad communication strategy, ultimately did change that overall, again, this temperature of the employer to a point where now they look at, if when they're actually going through their interview process, they're trying to identify who are the individuals in the group that may not have other opportunities because people aren't giving them a fair chance. And rather than looking at things that had nothing to do with the jobs, restructuring their interview process to focus solely on those functional requirements of the job. And then within that part, how do we provide accommodations within the context of the job interview? All right, I know I'm out of town, so I'll jump through. So,
Thank you. Oh dear.
Great, thank you. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about some ongoing work that I've been doing with Andrew Houghtonville. This paper is a little bit different than some others that you've seen today. It is, in some sense, a policy thought piece about, specifically about policy design for SSDI. And I would say more than lessons from the VA program at this point, we're drawing ideas from the VA disability program. So it's just green, okay. So the motivation here, the focus is on employment and labor force participation of people with disabilities. And so I think taking for granted that the statistics are well known to people in this room, we have decades of declining labor force participation alongside decades of growth in the SSDI program. And although the findings aren't universal in terms of magnitude, there are a number of studies that indicate that the program is probably lowering employment and labor force participation itself. So that's going to be the motivation for the question that we're asking. One of the main way that economists would describe what is probably at least part of the incentive problem that is preventing people from working or even participating in the labor force, we would do it in terms of, we call budget constraints, thinking graphically about the relationship between people's total income, which is on the vertical axis, and the hours that they work on the horizontal axis. So these are annual numbers. And so this is just plotting out what that relationship would look like for someone who earns $15 an hour. In orange, or someone without SSDI, so they start at 0, and they accumulate $15 per hour. And although you can't make the graph show it easily, that would go up all the way to the end of the graph, sort of underneath that blue line. The navy blue line is the SSDI program, and you see this famous cliff effect where someone can keep the full SSDI benefit, but only up till the point of reaching SGA, okay? And so that, in this set of numbers, would occur for this person at $32,000 and change. So basically working half-time, but the incentive's pretty stark when you look at the fact that that same person without SSDI would have to be working, or even if the person went past SGA, kept working, they'd have to work twice as many, another 20 hours essentially, to get to the same level of income. So there's a clear incentive problem. And this has been a focus of a lot of talks about policy design. This cliff point, this is what economists would call a substitution effect incentive. And that's that at the point of a person, particular person reaching SGA earnings levels, all of a sudden the monetary return to an extra hours of work, it doesn't, as in some other programs, it doesn't just diminish or even go flat. There's actually this big negative shock that all of a sudden you lose a lot of money. And people have realized that, and so there have been projects like the Benefit Offset Pilot Project, which reduced benefits gradually. I'm not going to show you another budget constraint, but basically it took that cliff and smoothed it off to some extent, taking away $1 of SSDI benefit for every $2 earned. And there was hope that that might create some momentum, but Weathers and Hemeter do a pretty comprehensive evaluation and find no effect on either mean earnings or the probability of having any labor market earnings. So we're thinking about an alternative model, and that is to borrow from the structure of the Veterans Administration disability program, focusing, it's pretty simple because it's focusing on the two key components of that program that we're going to argue both could make a difference in labor force participation of people who would otherwise be in the SSDI program. The first is that benefits, this is not an all or nothing program. It's not like SSDI where you either get onto the program or you don't. Benefits are given at 11 different levels of generosity, from 0 to 100%, depending upon the degree of impairment that the Veterans Association examiners believe that you have. We're going to focus on 1 to 100 because people at 0% get some services, but they don't get a cash benefit. And the second is that this lump sum monthly benefit isn't reduced by earnings or employment. So if you qualify medically, you have your degree of impairment, it doesn't matter what your wage is or how much you work, you have that benefit. So basically that last point is going to reduce, it's going to take away that cliff effect, and I'll show you a diagram of what that looks like in a second. So the VA, one of the big characteristics is that they have the distribution of ratings. This is the overall distribution, so 10%, so low percent impairment benefits are very common. You'll see in a minute, a lot of them are musculoskeletal problems, so 10%, and when you look at the full distribution, sort of dwarfs everything. This one's a little bit more helpful to me. In our analysis, we look at total numbers, everybody on SSDI, and we also look at, and on the VA, and we also look at the four most common, sort of averaged across the two groups, types of impairments. So we have mental in green, neurological is the next one, cardiovascular, and then musculoskeletal, and you'll see those 10% benefits. For musculoskeletal, also cardiovascular problems. Neurological looks a little different. We don't quite understand why, but they tend to rate people at 100, 70%, 50%, or 30%. A lot of them are sort of jumpy. Not a lot of people get 90 or 80% ratings, but then you see what the distributions look like. So the second part of the argument about why a VA design might spur more labor force participation is not just reducing the cliff, because people keep their benefits, they don't have their benefits fall to nothing at a certain amount of earnings, is an income effect, what an economist would call an income effect. And that's that when people's incomes rise, and this isn't from their earnings necessarily, but income in the household from a spouse, for example, when that income rises, they're less likely to work, and when that income drops, they're more likely to work. And so another effect of this benefit system, some people would keep their 100% benefit levels, but some people would get benefits at a lower level. And so all else equal, we would expect that to also have an effect on labor force participation. So this is, I probably should have put this first, this is, again, thinking about the budget constraints, so now you can see that cliff effect for the current traditional SSDI program against a very simple VA benefit budget constraint for somebody who has 60% of the full VA, 60% of the full SSDI benefit. And so they basically look like any other wage earner, they just have some extra income, okay? But significantly less, they have $8,000 compared to $14,000 some dollars because of that discount factor. So one thing that we would obviously be curious about is how to estimate this income effect. It turns out this is something we're still working on. The literature is not terribly helpful, but Otter and Duggan used, in 2001, the Veterans Administration announced that it would pay benefits for people who had diabetes because there had been clinical evidence that Agent Orange exposure was linked to diabetes. And so there were a whole bunch of people who automatically responded, gained benefits, and they found a 3% percentage point decrease in labor force participation. They don't actually provide a good base for that, but I think 6% is a relatively decent conservative number for that. So that's going in one way, but it would also suggest that for some people losing up to, going down to 60% of their benefit or 70% would spur an increase in employment. So the last thing that we're going to talk about before some concluding comments and what we're doing right now, we have done a basic simulation of what, not the labor supply effects, but what the budgetary effects and what distributions of benefits might look like under this new system. It's important to keep in mind that the system change would produce, two things would happen. One would be that some people who currently have SSDI, some would be 100%, but some would be less than 100%. But there would also be a number of new beneficiaries who are currently not getting SSD. A lot of them may be applying, but they have lower levels of impairment. They would be gaining a benefit. So because some of the new people would be gaining such a small benefit, we hypothesized the net employment effect should still be positive. It's less clear what the net budgetary effect would be. So again, this is a simple version. I'll tell you about what we were going to do to try and make it more realistic. But the first thing was to take the number of SSDI recipients, assume that the degree of disability required to get into SSDI currently is approximately equivalent to 60% on the VA scale. And I think we have some citations to back that up. Then we take the distribution of the VA percentage ratings between 60 and 100%. We see where people in the VA would fall, and we just apply that to the SSDI population because we don't. This is one thing we're lacking is we would love to have better data about types of impairment, degree of impairment, but we don't have that. So we're simulating it using the VA. This is what that would look like. And you would see, again, a number of people would still, 40% in a lot of categories, just under, would still have 100%, but there'd be a lot of people, for example, with neurological conditions that would be at 70% based on the VA distribution. And then we just use, average SSDI benefit, and we, depending upon, using the numbers we get in the discounted categories, we apply the percentage. And so for people who were current recipients, spending would fall on the aggregate by $2.22 billion. The second effect, though, would be for people not currently receiving a benefit. So we impute a denied number for SSDI, assume that all denied applicants get a partial benefit, somewhere below between 50 and 10%, and then again we apply, the VA distribution to that number, and we see, not surprisingly, a lot of people getting 10% benefits, especially for musculoskeletal complaints, but also, again, for whatever reason, the way they apply the neurology impairment percentages, they're jumpy at 70, 50, and 30. Again, use the total benefit and discount it, and this causes spending to rise by $1.46 billion. So this is what our simple simulation would suggest. We've done this with all beneficiaries, and then we've broken out mental, neurological, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, because they're large categories. It's interesting to see that there's net savings of $762 million overall, and in musculoskeletal, a lot of that because there's lower degree of impairment, but in some categories, mental health, for example, there might be more people with 50 and 30% impairments who might not get a benefit now would be getting a benefit. So our tentative conclusion here, is that there could be two advantages to using some part of the VA system design in SSDI, partial benefits and benefits that are not phased out or cut off at certain levels of income or earnings or employment. They're likely to generate stronger work incentives using a different margin of incentive instead of that substitution effect. What's the return to the extra hour, manipulating the base income. And they're also likely to generate budget savings even after taking account new beneficiaries. And that's interesting because that could be used, in a budgetary sense for trust fund issues. It could also be used to provide other services that people have talked about today. Caveats are important. There are a bunch of assumptions that our basic simulations make, that the degree of impairment is equal across programs. We don't have the programmatic data to be able to tell that. Also, that the degree of impairment is not correlated with earnings history, which determines your actual SSDI payment. That this is that the number of applications to SSDI doesn't change under the new system, but there's reason to believe that it would, that there might be this woodwork effect of people who have a disability who would apply. And there's also in the VA system, they have the sort of base benefit, but if you're at 100%, they give you an extra $1,000. So we don't include that. There's no, I think, a priori reason why Social Security would add on to the full benefit, but if you do that, it becomes much more expensive. So right now what we're working on is getting a better understanding of what the degree of impairment of the current SSDI beneficiary group, or at least current group of people who report disabilities, look like, so that we can understand what's going on with current beneficiaries, how impaired they might be, as well as the bigger unknown is what the new beneficiaries that might come into the system would look like. And so we've got pretty good data in the SIP topical modules about not just indicators for disabilities, but it has a pretty nice list of what medical condition caused the disability, which would match up nicely with this, and we can break it out and look at age distribution, earnings distribution, and things that would help us to refine some of those simulations. Thank you.
Okay, Elaine, Katz, and I are going to talk today about the 2017 Kessler Foundation Supervisor's Perspective Survey. The purpose was to identify practices used by employers to increase the employment of people with disabilities and the effectiveness of these practices. I'm going to move pretty quickly because this is a data-heavy presentation and we want to talk about the implications at the end. One of the things we wanted to address in this particular survey was the social desirability that was inherent in other employer surveys that have been done in the past, where the participants knew that those doing the survey knew the organizations that they were working for, and there's an inherent social desirability, I think, in getting responses that way. We focused on supervisors who knew we did not know where they were working. And we wanted to generate actionable information that could support the adoption of promising practices in the future. We had a little over 6,500 supervisors from across the country drawn from a Qualtrics business-to-business panel. And we were focusing on recruitment and hiring, onboarding and training, retention and accommodation. We wanted to know the processes and practices and their effectiveness. We wanted to know the supervisors and upper level management's commitment. And we also asked a lot of open-ended questions. The demographics of the respondents, the majority were female. The majority were white. We had good representation across the age groups, but the most of the folks who responded were between 35 and 54. And over 5,000 of the participants had a college education or greater, which is to be expected, given that they're supervisors. Company size, we had a good distribution. The largest, a little under 3,000, were large organizations with 500 or more employees. But we had a good representation of small organizations, small employers, as well as mid-size. We're first going to talk about upper level management's commitment and the importance of hiring, et cetera, to the supervisors. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. As you can see, from the perspective of the supervisor, upper level management commitment to hiring people with disabilities was about the same as the supervisors. In terms of supporting people with disabilities learning the job, there's quite a difference in terms of how the supervisors felt about the importance of people learning the job versus their perspective of upper level management's commitment. In terms of providing accommodations, supervisors also found it much more important to provide accommodations than they felt upper level management's commitment was. We're going to talk about organizational processes, whether there was a process, whether it was effective, or whether it was as effective for people with disabilities. A large proportion of the organizations had a process. A large proportion of those who had a process felt it was effective. The supervisors did. And fewer, about 61%, felt it was as effective for persons with disabilities. Hiring goals. 57% of the supervisors said that their organization had a diversity hiring goal. 28% said they had a disability hiring goal, and only 12% included disability in the diversity initiative of the company. I'm going to move on to process supporting employees learn the job. 86% of the supervisors said they had a process. A large proportion, 93%, said it was generally effective, and 73% said it was as effective for persons with disabilities. Requesting accommodations. 66% of the organizations had a process for requesting accommodations, and 96% of those that had a process said they were effective. Centralized accommodation fund. This is interesting. Only 16% of the organizations had a centralized accommodation fund, but 94% felt that of those felt it was effective. Specific practices. Partnering with disability organizations. That is done frequently in communities that are attempting to, or in organizations, employers that are attempting to recruit people with disabilities. Only 27% of the supervisors said their organization, their employer, had partnered with disability organizations. But those who did, 95% felt it was effective. This is another question we asked for those who didn't have it or didn't know. We asked whether it was feasible, and large proportions of the supervisors felt it would be feasible. In terms of training supervisors in accessible application and interviewing techniques, Tim was talking about that. Only 40% of the supervisors said their employer had such a training, but those who did, 87% said it was effective. And again, large proportions of those who didn't know or said no, they didn't have this training opportunity said it would be feasible to implement. Hiring practices, review or audit hiring procedures. Only 47 or 43% of the supervisors said their employer had this practice. 86% said it would be effective. And large proportions also said who didn't have it or said it would be feasible to implement. Short-term outside assistance, such as job coaches, etc. Only 19% of the organizations said they use this definitively, and 25% said sometimes. Those who used it sometimes or definitively used it, large proportions felt it was effective, generally, and fairly large proportions felt it was as effective for people with disabilities. And 70% of those that didn't have the practice said it would be feasible to implement. Job shadowing. Large proportions said yes, they definitively use it or sometimes. Large proportions who did use job shadowing said it was effective. And fairly large proportions of those said it was effective for people with disabilities. And a fairly large proportion of those who didn't have the practice said it would be feasible. I'm looking for time. In terms of training, having on-site training by a supervisor or a coworker. Large proportions of the organizations did this sometimes or definitively said yes, they did this. Most felt it was effective of those that did have the practice, and high proportions of the organizations felt it was as effective for people with disabilities. And 77% of folks that didn't have this as a practice felt it would be feasible. Job sharing. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. As you can see, there weren't large proportions who had job sharing as an accommodation practice, but they felt it was generally effective and as effective for people with disabilities, but fewer felt it would be feasible. In terms of flexible work schedule, there were fairly large proportions that used it sometimes or frequently, and they felt it was generally effective and effective for people with disabilities, and lower proportions felt it would be feasible. Working from home. small proportions felt or used it definitively, or sometimes they felt it was generally effective, and they felt it was as effective for people with disabilities. But few felt, of those that didn't have it, felt it would be feasible. I'm going to move right to the key takeaways because I think that's probably what's most important. And that's Elaine who's going to talk about that.
Okay, so, why is this all important? Why are we doing all this work? And as been mentioned, I'm not really the data geek on this team. I'm always the context person. And how does it relate to the hiring of people with disabilities? And really, the survey is important because it's identifying key practices that we can use in the field and information that organizations can use as they do their work. So as you're looking for the commitments and importance, it really reinforces that nothing happens without effective directives from the top. And we even saw that today in Tim's presentation, that Hartshafter remarks didn't do anything without the CEO. So, when you're talking about organizational management, it's fine for a provider agency to talk to a manager and maybe they'll hire one person. But if it's a substantial company and you want more than one person hired, it has to come from the top, even if that company is saying, oh yeah, we all share in management decisions. That's not going to happen. And it's really important, it's not surprising that supervisors were really saw it important that they were being judged. They attach much importance for learning the job and providing accommodations. Why? Because they're ranked in their own performances depending on the people who work under them. So if they don't make sure their team does a good job, they won't get a good rating. So it really, we saw throughout this, whether it's accommodations or learning jobs or onboarding, whatever it was, the supervisors are going to be much more invested than anyone else who's directly affecting this. And when we're talking about effective processes, companies do have some processes in place, and they believe those are effective for people with disabilities. If you talk to people in the field, they'll say they're not. You have algorithms, you have all kinds of obstacles for people with disabilities. But when companies say they have an accommodation process, maybe they need that provider in the field to work with them to say, well, you need the accommodation on the interview, forget the job. I mean, maybe you need an interpreter there. Maybe you need somebody to help read an application. Maybe you have to have somebody who interfaces better and has more sensitivities, who's the initial screener in that company. So I think you really have to think differently and out of the box to be able to use these in the field. And when we're talking about specific practices, this is my favorite, because a survey showed that only 27% of organizations, big companies, use providers for help or other assistance. But when they did, 95% found it effective. So what does that mean for everybody who's doing job placement and working in the field and the providers? It means you need to convince employers by using this kind of data that if we come in and we help you, it is going to help diversify your employment practices. We are going to make a difference. And I know they may not want to be on site. There's been a lot of talk with employers not wanting job coaches there a lot of times, but at least initially to help them meet those candidates and work through the recruitment process, that can really help. Amazon worked with Northwest Center, Sears worked with Tangram in Indiana, Cintas worked with ViaQuest in Ohio. Our project involved Pepsi and Ability Beyond. So companies are looking at getting that help to what they need. And also, I skipped a slide, but that's okay. But when we're talking about common practices with universal design, I think it's really, really important to say, yes, there are lots of things we can do. We need to help providers think differently and think more objectively of what their value is to the employer and to talk their language. We've heard a lot about it, but it's also those CEOs and advocates in the field. Randy Lewis was one of the first really to not only start the initiative at Walgreens, but we've taken him on the road to talk to other CEOs. And he typically, some of you don't know this, but he has a summer home in Illinois, and every summer he invites 5 or 6 people who are key in the corporate field to come and talk and learn about employment. So he's helped Meijer supermarkets, he's helped Best Buy, he's helped UPS, Office Depot. So what does it mean for future studies looking at the survey? Well, obviously, we've collected lots and lots of data, and we got lots of comments, and that's always the most difficult to put together. But we're really interested in doing a deeper dive into all the comments so we can learn, what were some of the really hidden gems that the survey provided. And we also made an option to contact the respondents at a later date, and hopefully we may be able to do that. So thank you all for letting us come before and talk about the survey. And if you want any information, please email John and I. You can see our contact information.
Thank you all. Now we have, I show maybe 7 minutes for questions. There are mics in the room. If you would raise your hand, or if there's anybody online with a question, I'm sure they will tell me. Okay. Yep, go ahead.
All right, here we go. Leslie Kaplan from Nidler. Tim, this is a question for you.
Uh-oh.
Don't
Well, this is my
panic.
project officer, so I got to be very careful what I say.
And I've never done this before with a grantee, but don't worry. So in the morning, this morning we spent some time talking, there were, I think, a couple presentations that talked about employment quality. And I think what's going on, and for a couple members of the panel, this panel, we're talking about employer quality. And you mentioned a few times in your presentation the idea of employer temperature, and I wonder if you could give the audience some idea of what you mean by that.
Of course. We think about employer temperature. I think actually as an audience, you described it pretty well based on the questions that I started off with. What are those, except for Purvey, who's very close to, we're going to look at money, which it's important. But when we look at an employer, it isn't just the CEO giving a direction saying we're going to be a disability inclusive workplace. It's to what extent have they set up the policies, the practices, to what extent do the other employees look at disability as being an equal member of our employment community versus being a secondary group, versus being an enclave that we're going to accept because it looks good somewhere on paper. So when we think about that disability, that employer temperature component that is part of what we're looking at under the RRTC is what is that environmental piece? When we think about when we go to a job, what else is the job giving us as far as, are we happy to be there? Are we happy to be around the people? Do we feel like we're accepted by those individuals? And just how does that acceptance come through? And again, in the case of the measuring temperature, it starts with the things that we would look at as far as helping people be retained long-term. We think about those flexible work strategies, the flexible accommodations. To what extent do those show up in the recruitment? To what extent do those show up in the interview processes? And it's really the privation of those policies throughout the company versus being isolated components. One of the other kind of parts to that is to what extent, not just that great information. It's interesting with doing some interviews in a couple of other focus groups for other parts of the project, where you end up talking with folks and they'll say, well, I think we have it, but if you ask the typical employee, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. So to what extent do we make all employees at interview, at hire, as part of an ongoing piece to remind them, here are the policies that we have in place to support individuals from a diversity standpoint, but for individuals with disability as part of that diversity. And it does show up in thinking about that climate, that temperature of the company as far as, when someone goes to work, is it a warm place, is it a safe place, versus is it I'll say the opposite, that cold, isolated piece where there are a number coming through and the idea is to get them in and out the door and get them to get that productivity kind of piece done.
Questions? I have another one back here.
Daniel Davis from ACL. Given that disability is mentioned in terms of employment for reporting for federal contractors and that federal hiring initiatives have highlighted disability, to what do you ascribe the lack of acceptance in the business community that disability is a portion of employment diversity? Because that number jumped out at me when I heard that.
I think, John or Elaine, that's for you.
I can try. Well, I think, I'm not going to answer it directly at first. I think when disability is made part of the diversity agenda within a corporation, that has the capacity to harness all the aspects of a company that a company has built on in order to create that diversity agenda. And we happen to be engaged with a fairly large corporation, a pharma corporation, whose HR director, as well as the compliance officer within the corporation, they have embraced the diversity agenda, and the inclusion of people with disabilities, people with disabilities are being included in the diversity agenda. They have a ways to go. They're working on it, but I think, two things: upper level management is driving it, and also people with disabilities are now firmly ensconced in their diversity agenda. The other side of the question, I don't think I can answer. Maybe Elaine can.
I can just add one thing, is that when you look at the workforce development field in general that doesn't include disability, they don't include disability. So they look at diversity as your typical female, LGBTQ, all the other categories. So it's a huge problem, and the foundation world is starting to look at it. Ford Foundation is starting to look at it. I think workforce development in general is starting to look at it. So I always say workforce development and disability employment, the agencies and providers that work in that segment are on parallel tracks. They don't intersect. So until really the wide definition of diversity includes disability, it's still going to be an issue.
3:30, I am guessing that we should end. So let me thank my panelists and thank all of you for your attention.